It is my pleasure to introduce Sara Konrath. She works at the University of Michigan and also the University of Rochester Medical Center, and she'll be speaking about empathy today.
So first, thank you, wow. Empathy, right here, right now. So first I wanted to thank you all, because I'm sure by the end of the day there'll be some phasing out happening. So just kind of nod once in a while and I won't notice. Of course I want to thank the funders, that's why we're here, and the members of my lab. I had to come up with a creative acronym as well. I haven't Googled it and I dare not, but anyway, it's iPair. And I hope I don't get sued from Apple for that. And also my collaborators and grad students at Michigan. Okay, so Christian and I were talking at lunch and saying this definition of empathy is something that books have been written about, and I'm not going to do that to you. So I think a really good definition for me of empathy is the ability to, or not necessarily the ability, but when somebody is experiencing perspectives and feelings that are more congruent with another person rather than themselves. So this is important to look at perspectives versus feelings. So perspectives is looking at more of the cognitive aspects of empathy, so the ability to get inside another person's mental space and see the world from their point of view, compared to the emotional aspects of empathy that are, I'm sorry, I should have done that, that are more about actually feeling what they're feeling and sort of resonating with an actual other person's emotion. And furthermore, we can also look at situational empathy compared to dispositional empathy. So situational empathy is something that obviously everyone can feel, and often it's elicited by other people's distress. I'm not necessarily going to be talking about that today. I'm talking more about dispositional empathy, which is a personality trait, and I would argue a character trait. So empathy is important. It's important as a foundation of moral, spiritual, and ethical life, and it's very important in many religions and also philosophical traditions. I see it as a bridge that moves us from our own selfish points of view into the ability to connect with something bigger than ourselves. So it's really the fundamental beginning of any relationship, or at least a functional relationship. So in psychological research, it's correlated with automatic mimicry of facial expression. So people who are high in empathy don't even realize they're doing this, but when someone is making a certain facial expression, they'll do the same thing. It's also correlated with fewer antisocial acts, such as bullying, although I thought it was interesting today that the discussion of popular bullies came up, because I think perspective-taking skills can be used, obviously, to imagine how to really hurt somebody. But with empathic concern, the feelings of empathy, often that's going to make people not want to hurt any other people. And it's also correlated with more everyday prosocial acts, like helping and volunteering. So, of course, there are many reasons for prosocial behavior besides empathy, such as obligation, resources, and social desirability, because basically it makes you look good to do nice things, and also self-enhancement, because maybe you like the feeling that you get from helping. So I'm interested in what situations might strengthen the relationship between the trait of empathy and the prosocial behavior. So are there certain situations that will make people more likely to act in line with who they think they are empathically? And in particular, I'm looking at empathy as a trait and also resources, and specifically people's energy levels. And this time of day I think is really interesting after listening to talks all day. So that's why I have a sugary Coke, and I hope there's some sugar and other energy, maybe caffeine in the audience there too right now. So psychologists really widely study this. Empathy is a topic that's studied widely by many different disciplines, so I will look forward to feedback in this unusual interdisciplinary environment. But psychologists see it as fixed ability or more malleable, and I don't think that they necessarily disagree. I don't think there's like some people who only see it as fixed or people who only see it as malleable, but people tend to focus in on particular areas. So some researchers look more at the genetic underpinnings of empathy, and there is some sort of heritability with trait empathy. There's also some stability across time. So children who score high in empathy at one time also tend to score high in empathy at another time. And this also is shown in adults, and there's consistency across situations as well. So for example, a child who's empathetic toward their mother is also going to be empathetic toward other people like strangers. So There is some sense that empathy is something, to some extent, that people are born with, and that is pretty fixed, but at the same time, it is also part of it's malleable. So it's responsive to immediate situations, as I mentioned, and often, for example, marketers are quite aware of this and use emotional appeals to get people to respond in a certain way. There's this thing called the identifiable victim effect, where you might hear of thousands of people, for example, who died in an earthquake, and if you hear that, you're going to be less likely to respond prosocially than if you hear about one particular person who was affected. So it is quite sensitive to these types of emotional situations. It's also a skill that is affected by motivation, but the research on this is quite limited at this point. There's some studies showing that when you give people some sort of incentive to be more empathetic, or at least particularly to be more accurate about reading facial expressions of emotion, that they can actually become more accurate at it, which points to some motivational element. Also, there's really interesting studies by Batson finding that certain people, if you're given a chance to avoid helping, kind of like the cross the street phenomenon, if you see somebody asking for money, like the Salvation Army at Christmas, they're asking for money, and you can avoid that situation, that low empathy people will do what they can to get out of that situation as long as it doesn't make them look bad. But people who are high in empathy actually will do what they can to pursue those situations, and even if there's a chance for them to escape, they're not necessarily going to take that chance. So another point in terms of the malleability of empathy is some research that we've been doing in our lab tracking empathy and related traits across time in the United States. And we've specifically focused on college students over time because that's just the most frequently studied population. But we found that trait empathy has been declining since the 1980s among American college students, and both the emotional aspects of empathy, so empathic concern, and also the more cognitive aspects, like perspective taking, have been declining. There's other research showing actually that empathy is teachable, and this research is often done in small children, but I think it's also possible within adults. And parenting seems to also affect empathy, so certain types of parenting styles that are more emotional and empathic and open to emotional life tend to create children who are also more empathic. In intervention studies have shown that empathy can increase when students are taught to improve their emotion recognition abilities or social skills, when they focus on similarity between themselves and others, and also when they've tried to role play someone else's feelings. Also practicing, if they practice imagining another person's perspective, often during situations where they observe other people's misfortunes, and then also when they've been exposed to other people's, or to empathic role models. So there's a literature on this in children. I've seen also some recent studies in medical students, because medical students tend to, start off being lower in empathy to begin with compared to other professions, but then also throughout medical school they start to decline, and especially their clinical year when they might need it the most. We're laughing, I think, because we've been there, the doctor situations. So there's been some attempt now in recent years to try to train doctors and medical students to be more empathic. And there seems to be a little bit of success in that, but I haven't completely reviewed that literature. It's just interesting to see it can be done in adults as well. So here's why I think empathy is arguably a character trait. One, because it's so central to ethical and moral life. Because there are individual differences in the capacities, and to some extent those differences are driven by motivation and also by practice. So there does seem to be some choice involved in empathy, which makes me see it as a character trait. So the overarching idea of my project is a metaphor. I think we can use a metaphor to understand, but empathy sort of being like a muscle that after exercising empathy, people can become depleted. And especially people who are less in shape, it should be more depleting for them to empathize than people who are more empathic. So an example of this, there's probably some of you in here who Has anyone ever run a marathon? Anybody? Okay, has anybody ever, wow, we're all academics, I forgot. Okay, has anyone ever done a 5K? Okay, but notice there's differences, okay? There's some people here who have done them, and there's some people who haven't, okay? So for the people who've done a 5K, it's probably not too intimidating or too difficult. It's not gonna put you on the couch for 2 days if you go ahead and do a 5K. You're probably gonna train a little bit, but you'll be fine. But for people who haven't and who like are couch potatoes and don't really move their muscles, it would not be a good idea, and it would be difficult and depleting and costly. So that's the idea. And I'll be running my first marathon coming up in a couple weeks, and I'm a little nervous because I'm more of the couch potato kind. Anyway, it could also be strengthened. So muscles, with practice, you can become stronger. It takes motivation and so on. But hopefully the idea is that if you strengthen your empathy through practice, that later on it should become less depleting when you're in a situation where you need to empathize. So that's kind of the overall idea of the studies we're going to work on. So the question is, does empathy take energy? And right now, not much is known about the role of immediate energy resources in creating and in maintaining empathic capacity. So we're curious about the immediate physiological consequences of empathizing compared to remaining objective, and I think this is a question that has a lot of implications for situations like, or professions like doctors and nurses and teachers even, because that's part of our job, but also in terms of when we're in situations where we have to care for others like parents or caregiving for sick loved ones and so on. And there's some theoretical work that hypothesizes that empathizing can be difficult and can soak up limited cognitive resources. There's no empirical work that we're aware of that actually randomly assigns people to empathize compared to control and looks at what happens to them physiologically. However, there is work in compassion fatigue. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. That's correlational work just showing that people can, in fact, become burned out after they're spending a lot of time caring for others. So what we're doing is a little bit different from that because we're actually in a lab setting going to look at what is the immediate effect of empathizing. So this is based on prior research actually in self-regulation and self-control. The idea from the ego depletion studies is that exercising self-control takes effort and is depleting to people. And these studies find that literally it reduces blood glucose levels, which makes it more difficult for participants to later maintain their self-control. So people will do some sort of act of self-control. Maybe they'll not buy that nice pair of shoes on Zappos or something. And then later on, if they refuse or are able to not buy that nice pair of shoes, then maybe that's going to deplete them and they're going to go off and eat a piece of chocolate cake like the really good cake at lunch today. So those of you who ate that cake, just think about if there's some self-control you had done before then. This is very much based on that literature, which that's about as much as I'm going to review it, but I really encourage people to look into it if they find that intriguing. But we wondered whether empathizing itself was depleting in the same way. So our first specific aim was to examine the extent to which an empathic act would actually deplete energy, and we operationalize energy as literally blood glucose, as it's been done in the literature on self-control. So we hypothesized that empathizing will indeed deplete glucose compared to when people are remaining objective. But we went a little further than that, and we said, especially for those who are low in dispositional empathy, it should be more difficult for them to empathize when we actually ask them to do that. For high empathy people, it should be easier because it's something that's more automatic, and they shouldn't find it as depleting. Does that make sense? Okay. So the second aim of study 1 was to examine the extent to which the energy depletion, so that if glucose does decline after empathizing, is this associated with later prosocial behavior? Is it going to make people less likely to help in a helping task? And we hypothesized that low empathy people should be less likely to help after empathizing because they've been depleted, if that in fact is what we find. And then high empathy people should be more likely to help, perhaps because empathizing just reminds them of who they are or who they see themselves to be. So just to briefly review the methods, before participants came into the lab, we measured their empathy using the Davis interpersonal reactivity task, which looks at both cognitive and also emotional aspects of empathy. About 1 to 2 weeks later, they came into our lab, and they were fasting for 3 hours before they came into the lab. So might have been a little hungry, but we took their glucose levels at the beginning we just used standard diabetic testing supplies to test their baseline glucose. We then randomly assigned participants to so everybody then listened to a radio clip of a woman named Katie Banks, who's often used in empathy research as a sympathetic target. She's a woman who is a student whose parents just died in a car accident, and she is saying she might have to drop out of school to take care of her siblings. And she's very distressed. You can hear it in her voice. So it's a really moving radio clip. And participants are asked to either remain objective when they're listening to that clip, or to imagine her feelings and perspectives while they're listening to it. So we don't use the word empathy. We just ask them to think about what she might be feeling and thinking. We then immediately take their second glucose level, and there's only been a span of 3 to 5 minutes in between that time. And then we measure some other self-report questionnaires, but I haven't analyzed those data yet, so I can't speak about them yet. And then later, we tell them then that the study's done, thank you for participating, and you can go. It's a 1-hour study, so we know people have time because by this point, it's been only about 35 minutes. So we know it's not that they had made a plan to be somewhere, but we want them to kind of have a chance not to help if they don't want to. So there's a helping task in which they're supposedly asked if they would maybe help the professor, me, do a pre-test. And the RA is instructed and trained to say, it's a little bit boring, and you don't have to do it because the study's over, they're already paid, it's done. But if you want to help, you can. It's up to you. And so this does seem to differentiate people. Not everyone helps, and not everyone leaves. So the first part I'm going to show you is the results for the glucose study, or the glucose part of the study. So what we found is that empathizing with others was indeed associated with overall declines in glucose compared to remaining objective. But it was not what we predicted. It wasn't that people who are low empathy had especially big declines in glucose. It was just everybody. So dispositional empathy was not moderating our effects. And so you can see these lines here. I'm just going to show you. So this line here is the empathizing condition, and here's the first glucose measure and the second one. This is a statistically significant line. There's a decline from time 1 to time 2 for people who empathized. And this is not here. It's not significant. It remains the same in the objective condition. The glucose does not change. At time 1, there's no difference between these two lines, and then at time 2, there is. But again, this is not dependent on people's empathy level, so it's really not what we expected. We kind of expected that this pattern would be there only for the low empathy folks. We also want to know to what extent the decline in glucose is related to helping behavior later. And we hypothesized that low empathy people should be less likely to help after empathizing again because of the depletion, and then high empathy people should be more likely to help. So what we find is that low empathy people, yes, they're less likely to help after they've empathized compared to when they're objective. High empathy people are more likely to help after empathizing. So there's that pattern. You can see in the objective, the darker bars are the low empathy people, and they become less likely when they imagine somebody's perspective, a distressed person's perspective, they are less likely to help later. But somebody who's high in empathy, when they've imagined that person's perspective, compared to when they're asked to be just neutral, they're actually more likely to help. So the empathizing instruction seems to somehow make people more trait consistent. But this was not associated with the amount of glucose decline. So again, not exactly what we thought would happen. Participants who experienced more declines in glucose basically helped at the same rate as those who experienced even rises in glucose. So there's nothing happening there. So I don't think that the helping behavior is being driven by recent changes in glucose in particular. However, this is breaking news because I did this at like 2 a.m. And you'll know why by the end of the talk, why it was 2 a.m. specifically. But it was what I did look at is overall glucose, which is what is their glucose level, sort of more as a individual differences metric, which is completely post hoc and preliminary. But I wondered if something more, not stable, but less about the last 3 minutes would be an important predictor. And what we found, or what I found in that, and just again preliminary data, is that the pattern in that slide was especially pronounced for people who came in the lab with high glucose. So just going back to that slide, that pattern is really the people who have high glucose coming in the lab, except for it was more extreme. So the low empathy group here, it was 0%, none of them helped if they had high glucose. And these guys, if they had high glucose, 89%. So it really differentiated, it really made people trait consistent to have high glucose and also then to empathize, to have a relevant situation. So if anything, what I'm thinking is going on is that high glucose energizes people to behave in more trait consistent ways, as long as there's a relevant context. So this is really the best I can come up with at the last minute, but I'd love to hear feedback on it. We're now conducting a second study to better understand these declines in glucose, because any psychologist who knows this literature is probably aware that there's been some recent critiques of the literature suggesting that actually it's probably not possible for the brain to use glucose in that short amount of time the way that the original self-control researchers thought. So it's getting into some very technical stuff here, but I really thought that maybe, well, one thing we were aware of when we wrote this grant was that using glucose, relying on it exclusively, might be a limitation. It turns out it might be, yes, because it could mean something else, and we should really look at other physiological measures as well. There's an alternative idea, which is that this actually might be getting at stress regulation. So glucose can enter the bloodstream during the fight or flight response, so under stress. So it's possible that the declines in empathy in the empathizing group were really just a reflection of what was happening anyway, because there was a fasting glucose level. So in other words, maybe empathizing did nothing. And what really happened was that people who are objective found it stressful, and their liver was releasing glucose to help them deal with the threat. We really don't know, so it's just something we're kind of exploring with another study, where what we're doing is changing. We're looking at other physiological measures, such as hand grip strength, so a pre and post, like how strong are people before they empathize, and then how strong are they after, how much changes are in that strength, and also a cognitive task. And we're correlating that with glucose changes to see what's really going on there. We're also changing the target of help, because I think another issue is that the target was this professor who had nothing to do with the original person's distress. And now we're actually asking them if they'll help the actual person, so if they'll help Katie Banks in some way. So that might change some of our results as well. We have some pilot data just testing out the strength measure, and we actually found surprisingly that males who empathize actually become stronger in the hand grip. So I don't know, but we'll see what happens with the real study, but I thought it was very intriguing. Nothing happened. So if they were objective, they remain the same. They didn't change in their power, but if they're empathetic, they just had this extra boost. And then women, there was no effect of empathizing for women. So I thought that was really interesting, and might tell us that actually the declines in blood glucose might be more of a stress regulation argument, but we'll see. Next year, we'll see. So we will be running another study as well, which is to examine the effect of empathy building exercises on people's empathic capacity, so their resilience to depletion. So we think that these exercises should build people's capacity as empathizing starts to become more automatic and practiced, and that high empathy people should be less affected by these exercises because empathizing is already automatic for them. So what we're doing, we're going to be running the study in the fall. We first need to see what happens with the current study. But what we're going to do is a text messaging study where people will be randomly assigned to receive messages that are either to imagine what other people they're interacting with are thinking and feeling in that moment, or if they're not interacting, it will be imagine someone they love and what they're thinking or feeling, versus control messages such as that they should think about what they're feeling right now, or they should look out the window, or something that's not related to empathy. And we will also look at pre and post measures of capacity as we're doing right now. Also, we're developing an implicit measure of empathy that we'd like to throw in here. But we're going to really see what's going on with the glucose. We may not use glucose as in this final study, but we might use hand grip or something that actually is much more clear. But I was thinking that this would be really fun to use eventually to develop an empathy app. I don't think I'm going to make money off of this because I don't know who'd buy one. But maybe if you named it something else. I just think it would be really neat to kind of move the research forward in terms of how to train empathy and how to make people more empathetic into the electronic age. Because it's been done in sort of the old way, in seminars, this is how you become more empathetic. Here, let's pretend, let's try to be empathetic, all this stuff. But we're all connected to these devices now. It'd be very interesting to see if we can work with these devices to actually address some of the issues of declining empathy. On other future directions, I want to continue to look at physiological effects of empathizing compared to remaining objective in this sort of experimental lab setting, and including maybe looking at cortisol and other effects immediately that occur from imagining other people's perspectives. And as I said before, it really has a lot of relevance to everyday situations and many professions. And also, I'd like to continue to examine situations that might build empathic character, and I've been actually in one recently. So there's May 6th, we had an early arrival. I might not have been here otherwise, but he was, our son Felix was born on the 6th, and he was due on the 23rd. So I've been up all night, every night for a month. And I can't believe I'm here right now, but I'm happy that I am. So please, if something didn't make sense, that's why. But I'm really better at over email because I have a little more time to think, and I'll still take your questions. So please don't be shy.
So very interesting. Two questions. One conceptual and then one about the empathetic training. The conceptual one, do you think perspective taking and empathetic concern are both necessary components of empathy? So I think that Batson, I think, doesn't think that now, at least. And then the question about empathetic training is, are you focusing on each of those elements in the training? Are you proposing ways to train up the perspective taking and separate or complementary ways of training up the empathetic concern?
So I agree with you. I think that you need to have both perspective taking and empathic concern to I think have maybe the empathic character, because if you have only perspective taking, you can use it to your advantage and use it to just get what you want, and I'm sure some psychopaths are pretty good at perspective taking. You need to have, you also need to care, which is sort of the empathic concern. Empathic concern, you could say, is the trait version of it. If you're going to look at the emotion that's associated with it, it's compassion. So if you have just the ability to read people's minds, but you don't feel compassion, I think that's pretty scary, and I would want to see those two together in order to have that character trait. In terms of whether we've actually separated that for our next study, we haven't done it. We're in the process of designing the messages based on prior research. I'm not sure how I would train people to be empathically concerned. I think it's much easier to train them to have better perspective-taking abilities, because you can say, imagine the perspective of this person. You can say, imagine what they're feeling, but that's still kind of getting at perspective-taking. But how do you get a person to, with a text message, suddenly feel what the person is feeling, resonate with the other person's feeling? So, I mean, if I could figure out how to create the right message, I'd like to do that. But right now, we are just going to combine them.
I had two comments. I was thinking about the finding that men were stronger after empathizing. I actually find it fairly intuitive. The explanation being that after you empathize with the person who's suffering, you feel like you want to do something. And that's the increase in strength, is now I have motivation to help or provide assistance or something like that. So
why not women? Why?
Maybe they have the same motivation in both conditions. I don't know. But so that's one comment, is that maybe preparing,
so that it energizes
preparing for action.
I had a thought about that maybe men felt that
empathizing was kind of feminine, so they wanted to be more masculine. And
So it's like a reaction, like
yeah, yeah, that was my thought, but I don't know.
That's good. So
Different assumptions there. I'm assuming men actually care about people who suffer.
at least when it comes to individual difference trait measures of empathy, women do score higher on average. But when it comes to physiological responses that have been measured, there's no gender difference. So who knows? But that's either of them are interesting.
I had an additional comment too about the types of empathizing that may be depleting. Like, I feel like the kind you're studying might actually not be depleting, to take the perspective of a person who's suffering in some way. I think what might be depleting is empathizing with somebody with whom you're in a conflict, and they have a point of view that you strenuously disagree with, but you need to understand their perspective and values and why they think you're so foolish and why you think they're so foolish. And I think that kind of empathizing might be quite depleting.
Yeah.
Whereas listening to somebody's difficulty may be much less depleting.
I think that the obvious point on there is like political parties, like trying to imagine, like no matter what, or if we have a political ideology, we think we're right, usually. I mean, it feels very true and real. And trying to get into the space of another person who has a very different political ideology is quite exhausting.
Sure.
Yeah, so I might be running a little bit low on glucose, so sorry if I just missed something. But
Don't drink the diet stuff.
were you assuming that remaining objective could not be depleted?
At the beginning, yes, but I'm thinking that less later.
Okay, good. Because I was thinking that often it can be very
yeah.
tough to remain objective,
especially
when you're, say,
in an
listening
emotional.
to a very emotional.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not sure the implications, but I don't know if you have.
So I mean, what would be nice is we would do a study where we have a control, where there's just not instruction, see what's happening compared to that. But I think the reason we didn't do that is because I thought people would naturally empathize. So maybe it is difficult to be objective when you're in this emotional situation. We do ask in those questions, the post manipulation questionnaire, we ask them how difficult was this, how tired did it make you feel, things like that. We haven't looked at those data yet, so these are just preliminary results, but we obviously should do that.
Oh, same question?
Oh.
Nancy, yeah.
Hi. I just have another clarification question, and I'm sorry to do this.
This is great. I know what to predict. It's nice.
What's that?
Well, you usually have them, so I tried to be ready.
You're talking about empathic concern and about empathy as compassion, basically having compassion for another person in distress. Yet the definition of empathy that you quoted in the beginning is broader. So it's someone who takes on perspective or feelings more congruent with others. So somebody is very angry because they've been mistreated. Does my empathy then? Does my empathy require that I have angry, that I'm mad too, right? And then so how does the empathic concern get in there?
I think it would be like your empathy requires that you're sort of taking on that feeling of anger, but at the same time you're feeling that the thing that's driving you to take on that feeling of anger is your feelings of compassion for the person who's describing the situation to you.
Okay.
And usually you're in a relationship when that's going on.
Okay, so you have to be moved. Excuse me.
I think so, yeah.
By what is going on.
Yeah.
I have a suggestion about marketing your app.
Yeah.
And then I would market it to medical schools and nursing colleges, and if you have the data that people in medical school lose empathy at certain points in their careers, and you want to have empathy, then I would.
So I can market it to the schools, but I don't know if the students. I shouldn't market it directly to the students.
No.
Jessica?
It's sort of a question related to an earlier question about your first study. I'm wondering if the results of your first study could be explained by the fact that in the what participants are doing is in the objective condition they're not really tracking the story, whereas in the perspective taking condition they really have to pay attention. So I wonder if it's just a difference in the sort of cognitive effort or cognitive load that's required.
Mm-hmm.
If you thought about maybe running a cognitive load condition to look at that, or just looked at their respective memory for the details of the story.
Yeah, I think adding a cognitive load manipulation could be a good way, but also I have to look through the questionnaire items to see if there's anything that could maybe answer that question. Because that could have, I mean, they could have been like, remain objective, all right, let me check my whatever, my empathy app.
Angela.
So I have to admit, I have general skepticism. I work with Ron Kurtzman, and we think Roy's wrong, so that's the short way of saying it. But if it's not glucose, right? If that story doesn't hold up, then what is this metaphorical cognitive resource? It doesn't feel right from all we know about the way the brain works to think that something runs out.
Well, I mean,
it's more plausible to me that motivation runs out. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. I
don't think glucose runs out, but I actually, what happened with that was I knew the ego depletion literature quite well, and then I found out about this critique after. So I've actually been pretty persuaded by the critical point of view about the glucose depletion studies.
Is it correct to call it depletion of a resource? Like, does it feel like depletion? I mean, it certainly feels.
Well, that's something we can look to see if people who are more have more declines in glucose, if that correlates with them saying that they feel tired or that the task was difficult. So we can see, and if that's not the case, then I would say it's probably not really the greatest measure. And we didn't find what we expected with that either. It wasn't later affecting whether they're going to help.
Yeah, I guess I'm just making the point that if it's not glucose and we can't think of another resource that it is, maybe it's not a resource.
Yeah, maybe it's not a resource, yeah.
Laura?
One analysis you might want to do down the line if you haven't done it yet is take your glucose measure as well as some of your self-report, how tiring and difficult was this measure, and then interact that with your dispositional empathy in predicting subsequent helping. I have a series of studies where we actually show that traditional depletion paradigms leads to increased help among some groups of participants and decreased help among other groups of participants. The variable we used was just the length of time you've been in a relationship, and we're thinking that it's something along the lines of you have these defaults. So if your default is to be prosocial, you get depleted and then you enact that habit. Versus if your default is to be more individualistic, you get depleted, then you enact that. But you might find some of the interactions that you were looking for maybe between your mediating variable and your DV rather than at the start. So there might be a way to resuscitate that finding when you get into later analyses.
Yes, I'd love to read that paper actually, so if you...
Yes, when it is finished being written,
I'll
send it to you.
And then Aranda?
So I had a question about the text messaging information that you discussed very briefly at the end. And if you haven't thought too much about it, it's fine. But I wanted to ask more about the wording you envisage for it. Because I'm assuming you don't tell people a little more than simply saying, well, think about what the other person is feeling, right? I mean, for someone to feel empathy, it's a little bit more than just putting yourself in someone's shoes for a short period of time. So I guess for medical students it might be different because they would have received empathy training, so they would probably know what that means.
Right.
But for the average person, how much information or how much direction do you think you need to give someone for them to really sort of make the effort to spend time and put themselves in another person's position?
Well, we're in the middle of designing the specific messages, but the problem is it's a text message, so it does have to be short.
Exactly, yeah.
And we're kind of thinking sort of short bursts. So there have been these more programmatic, like, several weeks of like an hour a week in a classroom kind of thing, and that this can actually influence people's empathy. But I mean, I think it would be an interesting finding if we could do these little short bursts, like a few times a day that people are actually trying to do what we ask them to do, and that later on they're actually showing evidence of more empathy. So we're actually going to not only look at empathy as depletion, as I've talked about, but we're going to take measures of pre and post self-report empathy, implicit empathy, and also like objective measures such as people's ability to identify emotions, facial expressions of emotions, to try to see what's really going on if there is an effect of empathizing. So I think, yes, it's a very strong test of the hypothesis. Like we'll see what really happens, and we'll do the best that we can to design the best messages we can, but I think it would be very cool if we actually found that this was working. So yeah, it's going to be tough. We're working on it. Yep. Oh, sorry, that's not me. I see.
Sorry, Marie had her hand up first, but I noticed.
I just want to come back to a broader point that bothered me. Why is dispositional empathy going down in the population? Or there are some explanations?
So what we found in our prior work, we conducted something called the cross-temporal meta-analysis, which means we took a bunch of studies that have already been published and we looked at the scores of empathy in college students across time. So that's what we did. As for the why, that was not really the point of our analysis. We just wanted to track it over time. So we have some ideas about why there might be changes. And my best answer to that is it's probably very complicated, and we should start to look at sort of people embedded within larger contexts and what's going on in these different contexts. So what's going on in people's family lives, what's going on in the educational system, in the media, in politics, and things like that. We can never really say why. So we can just document these changes, but we're finding them in narcissism. So trait narcissism has been rising at the same time. And we've recently did a similar analysis of attachment style, finding that people are more likely to say that they have dismissing attachment styles. So the way to measure that is to say, basically, I have no need for, I don't really need close relationships. And so more college students are agreeing with that over time. So we don't really know why, and I think I wouldn't make a strong case for this being the end of the world yet, because it's something I'd want to see replicated in a few more different studies to know that this is really happening.
On the other side of things, is there such a thing as too much empathy or dysfunctional empathy, and how does it, if so, how does it concern the two different aspects of empathy?
Yeah, I'm always waiting for that question, and all the talks I've ever given on this, I've never gotten it, so thank you. Because I think that I think that people do see this as a positive. It's a positive trait that we should try to be more empathetic. I do think there could be situations where it can be problematic, and that's part of why I think this research is important. Because, for example, if the act of empathizing can actually, cost people in some sort of way that's beyond just that it takes their time or whatever, but if it actually leads to some physiological harm in the empathizer, and if there is compassion fatigue associated with it, that's important to know. Also, sometimes I think people might have genuine empathy, but it might be misguided, so that and their empathy can lead them down like the wrong path. So, for example, with the identifiable victim effect, like they could hear a story or see an image of somebody who seems to really need help, and then maybe they're going to divert their resources there, whereas there's more important issues to deal with that maybe are less emotional, but it might be better to divert the resources that way. So there's a new book called Pathological Altruism you might be interested in by Barbara Oakley. I'm not sure she completely gets at what I'm saying here, but it does have some interesting ideas about maybe situations where it wouldn't be a good idea.
I think that's all we have time for.